other treatments, let's just talk about your book at a high level. Other treatments of Epstein have focused on his sex trafficking crimes. But I think what's interesting about your book is that, it really dives deeply into how interconnected the state sponsorship of all of this was, how intricately involved the government actively was working with him. So can we just start there? Why was that part of the story so interesting to you, how involved the government was, or the state sponsorship of Epstein?
Well, I first got interested in it because there was an obvious attempt to cover it up by the mainstream media and, of course, the government itself. So you had sort of inklings of this come out where you have Alex Acosta reported to saying that he went light on Epstein when he was, a U.S. attorney in Florida because he was told that Epstein had belonged to intelligence and was above his pay grade and whatnot. So, I wanted to sort of understand what that meant, right? Because if you say belong to intelligence, that could mean he was an asset, he was on the payroll, he was an agent. And does that mean one intelligence agency or multiple intelligence agencies? What exactly was the nature of that involvement? Because if you're talking about someone who's under fire for the sex trafficking of minors and there's an intelligence connection, that, means there's a state connection, like a government connection. And, as I note throughout the book, there's acts like this, scandals like this that have broken, really throughout American history in different administrations with powerful political connections, and they've been covered up pretty systematically. So it seemed like Epstein, there were efforts to have that happen with the Jeffrey Epstein case as well. And I think that's been pretty clear over the past few years or so. So in terms of what that state sponsorship was, I did my best to really just put all the information out there and people can sort of draw their own conclusions. But I think it's pretty conclusive that there was either one or two in state intelligence agencies that were involved with his activities. But it's not just limited to sex trafficking. So if you look at the mainstream media narrative of Epstein, it focuses pretty much exclusively on his sex trafficking from 2000 to 2006, give or take, right, with the exception of the Ghislaine Maxwell trial, which deals with some stuff in the 90s. But overall, it's mostly focused on a very specific activity in a very specific time frame. And this is someone who's, entered the workforce really at some point in the 1970s. And a lot of those intelligence connections go back to the 80s and arguably even 70s as well. And so there's a lot to unearth there. And a lot of his earlier, I guess, controversial behavior that he was involved with in those periods was seems to have been more focused on financial crimes and on arms trafficking as opposed to sex trafficking. But as I note in the book, a lot of the people he was working with in that period of time and also institutions were themselves involved in sex trafficking and in some cases the sex trafficking of minors as well. So he, saw this behavior somewhere else before he engaged in it himself. And these, institutions and entities that I refer to there were also tied to intelligence agencies in a very significant way. So this is something that, intelligence agencies seem to engage in when they believe it is to their benefit.
Yeah, I couldn't help. I mean, in the book you point out a couple of instances where, some of his colleagues were fried publicly about it, went to jail, and his name was just like mysteriously removed. Like, am I wrong about that?
Yeah, on the financial crime side. So Jeffrey Epstein and a man named Stephen Hoffenberg, and also Jeffrey Epstein's mentor, son of one of his big mentors. The mentor was Douglas Leese, a British arms trafficker with alleged British intelligence ties, and his son Julian Leese was also at this firm, and allegedly both Julian and Douglas Leese were involved, according to Steve Hoffenberg. But Steve Hoffenberg's dead, so you can't really ask him too many questions about it anymore, at least. But it was Steve Hoffenberg had created this company called Towers Financial, and Douglas Leese was allegedly a principal there and connected Steve Hoffenberg and Jeffrey Epstein. And once Jeffrey Epstein is on the scene, this is around 1987 or so, interestingly enough, the year he also is alleged to have linked up with Leslie Wexner. Jeffrey Epstein develops a Ponzi scheme plan that he and Hoffenberg enact using Towers Financial as sort of the vehicle for conducting this large, very massive Ponzi scheme. I think at the time it collapsed around 93 or so. It was one of at the point, maybe the biggest Ponzi scheme in U.S. history. At that point, I think it no longer holds that title. But yes, so in grand jury proceedings, the attorneys involved in prosecuting that case, their main narrative was that Jeffrey Epstein was the mastermind, and Stephen Hoffenberg confirmed this in his testimony to the grand jury. But then,
on March 9th, 2022, our commander-in-chief signed an executive order that aims to give Washington elites nearly full control.
Then, in a few months' time, Jeffrey Epstein's name is dropped from the case. And in 1993, Jeffrey Epstein is, instead of in prison like Steve Hoffenberg is, he's visiting the White House. And that may be related to why, his name was dropped from the case, because he became intimately involved in fundraisers. And one of the fundraisers he was first involved in, at least that we know about, in 1993, was related to a fundraiser for the White House Historical Association. And so the White House Historical Association fundraiser was supposed to be, led by the First Lady's office, Hillary Clinton, and her decorator, Kaki Hawkersmith. And reference to this particular fundraiser turns up in Vince Foster's quote-unquote suicide note.
What did he say in that suicide note?
So first of all, some background about the suicide note. It's very unlikely that Vince Foster committed suicide, first of all, but it's even more unlikely that the suicide note was actually his suicide note, because when his office was searched by police, when his body was discovered, there was nothing in his briefcase. It was completely empty. And then around 36 hours later, the First Lady's office announced that a suicide note had been found in his briefcase that had previously been seen empty, right? So the speculation as a result of that has been Hillary Clinton, or at least people around her, were responsible for the creation of this suicide note and wanted it out there for specific purposes, ostensibly to exonerate Hillary and the First Lady's office from any sort of potential wrongdoing, in this broader sphere of ongoings at the time Vince Foster died. And the only reference to Hillary Clinton in that quote unquote suicide note is related to this fundraiser, and how there was nothing funny about the money involved. And of course, as White House legal counsel at the time of his death, Vince Foster would have been responsible for determining if there was anything suspect about the finances of that particular fundraiser. And if you look at some of the names associated with this fundraiser, you don't just have Jeffrey Epstein, you have people like Clark Clifford, who, for example, was instrumental in having BCCI establish itself in the United States, with BCCI being the Bank of Credit and Commerce International, which is one of these organizations I sort of alluded to earlier that is, essentially masquerading as a bank, but is really a private intelligence apparatus that's sex trafficking minors, among other things, but involved in money laundering on a massive scale and all other sorts of just really insane and brazen financial crimes that were investigated by Congress and, sort of collapsed spectacularly in 1991. So, you have Clark Clifford, one of the masterminds of that there. You have Jeffrey Epstein, mastermind of this massive Ponzi scheme there. And then you have a banker that's affiliated with Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell in the Palm Beach area, who's very much established in the offshore financial system of the Caribbean. So, you put all of that together, it seems very likely that there was some sort of funny money there. And did it play a role in Vince Foster's death? I don't really know, but it's very interesting that you would have one of the earliest involvements of Jeffrey Epstein with the Clintons being mentioned in that particular quote unquote suicide note.
Yeah. How are you involved in a massive Ponzi scheme and then you just walk away and your name, you're just cleared from it?
Yeah, and why is Hillary Clinton going to these types of bankers to finance something that